started, Avishka, I think with sufficient amount of people that are alive. So this monkey problem, I think it's something a lot of people have been wanting to talk about or wanting us to talk about at least. And I think that it's a bit of a, at least from what we've seen on Twitter, I don't know if you've seen it, because the Chinese embassy has refuted any claims of having any sort of communication with our government, and says that they don't want them. It's a private company. So I think it's a bit of a distraction to the people from what is necessary at this juncture for Sri Lanka. And is there anything in particular that you want to talk about when it comes to, I don't know, like discussions that we as society should be having?
Yeah, I think what you see is like a lot of noise, like quoting monkeys, and then China came and said, okay, no, there's nothing like that. Similar to, I think, almost like the Disneyland saga that kind of played out a while back. It's almost like there's this mentality that, oh, we have like a brilliant one-off solution. And that when we do that, like all our problems are going to be solved. You kind of see this recurring, whether it's Disneyland, or maybe we build a port and then all our problems are solved, or a tower and all those problems are solved, and now we become monkeys. And the problem is, like the topic says, we keep monkeying around. We don't get down to the actual thing. Because to get changes, there need to be systematic changes from the root level, structural changes to make sure that it's not these one-off solutions that we hope for some savior to come and fix everything. We need to really change like the framework, the laws, some of the the thinking even behind some of these policies and everything. And I think there are a lot of areas which we can kind of, maybe not everything, but we can maybe focus on some of the key areas that need these major reforms.
Right. So would you like to start off with something that you think is pertinent?
Yeah, I think, one thing that's should essentially have already maybe started at this point, but something that should be in terms of your sequencing of the reforms or a priority at least is kind of restructuring Sri Lanka's safety nets. So that basically we have the Samurdhi, we have all kinds of safety nets. The problem is they're inefficient. One, they don't really target and get to the people who actually need it. We've heard stories on how politicized it is. It's contact. It's even the resources that go into it. One is insufficient, and two, it's badly targeted. So there needs to be a revamp, because obviously the economic crisis and the inflation and everything that came about is going to affect. These people are the most vulnerable. Those that need to be caught in the safety net are the most vulnerable. So one, it needs to be, updated. I think recently there have been talked about it at the cabinet. I think the day before spoke of agreed that they will go forward a discussive proposal with about 260 billion as the safety net funds. But the problem is, unless the targeting is fixed, it doesn't matter how much of money you pour into it if it doesn't go to the right people. So I think the first step is they would need to kind of see whether we need to broaden the base, who isn't in the net. We need to catch them in first, the people who actually need it. And then once that is done, you can kind of go around into figuring out, okay, how do we cut down? How do we remove people who are not there? So this can either be done decentralized. You can have either maybe from a village level, from your village local level, getting decentralized in the process to let them. Because at the end of the day, they are the people who actually know, okay, do these people, are they below the safety net, are they above, are they well to do? It's a bit hard for bureaucrats to be like a government office to kind of know all these things and kind of figure it out. Alternatively, they also can develop certain guidelines and systems. I know one thing is you can look at like the access-based, the housing, or basically your asset base to see where this person stands. I think people have also spoken about using electricity. There's been research done on that. There are, I think, there's no perfect mechanism, but there's definitely a need to have a proper framework in how this targeting is done, rather than the current state where it's highly politicized. Secondly, I think we also need kind of a centralized database where you kind of keep track on all these safety nets and you have the information in one. I think this is something we can come back again when we talk about governance. But the idea is that we don't have proper economic information. It's basically one, lack of transparency, two, lack of coordination among all the government agencies, so on and so forth. But you essentially need to make sure that these structures are in place, or else you will have this one-off payment in, and one, it won't go to the people who need it, and two, it basically you're getting a much less return on the resources you put in. So I think it's important that we get this right, because it's one of those major reforms that need to be done, and it shouldn't be one that's just done, you know, or maybe elections are coming up, let's hand out 5,000, 10,000 bucks. No, that's not how it should work. It needs to be, you know, a structural reform, we clean the slate, and we properly get a system in place. So even if the people in charge change, the system keeps working. And you know, those systems are essentially what make these problems like corruption, all of those kind of get wiped out. So I think that would be one of the reforms that needs to be filed. I think it's slowly happening, but obviously a lot more needs to be done.
Right. Okay. And another thing that I think that has to be discussed, and I think the government and the agencies are making stalwart progress, is the reformation of state-owned enterprises. I believe recently in the budget, the president set up, I think, a separate commission or a separate entity to handle the restructuring of these SOEs and the sale of them. But at the same time, we can see that there's a large amount of backlash. A lot of people, very validly at least, have a pushback saying, what happens to our national security if we start, selling off assets that are so vital to us? Where maybe we start selling off our energy, electricity production, or like fuel in itself. What happens to us and our security as a state? Is that something you can speak to, Avishka?
Yeah, so I think one thing is exactly what is your definition of asset, because I know politicians and some people just like brandy around, oh, this is like a national asset. But, you have your accounting and definition asset, and if you take some of the state-owned enterprises, they basically have a negative equity, and their liabilities far exceed all the assets, and they keep incurring on debt and payments, so on and so forth. So one thing is, I don't think there's like a blanket solution where you say, okay, everything is going to be 100% privatized, we are not going to own anything. Obviously, that's not, and that's not how the reform will go either. True, there are certain security concerns, but for example, even if you take the fuel market, there's no reason why you shouldn't allow other players in, because the role of the government is essentially, ideally, it acts as a regulator. So when it acts as a regulator, it can do its proper job and make sure that all these concerns can be addressed, and they can make sure that the players abide by the rules, so there are no such threats. But the problem here is when you have it as it's the regulator, you have it as the participant, and you keep competition out, that's when kind of the system breaks down. And also, there's a lot of nuance here, because sometimes you have these state-owned enterprises that are making, I don't know, spoons, or producing some commercial commodity, which really isn't needed. More often than not, these are the state-owned enterprises that are either sold off, or in the sense they're given to someone to manage from a political connection. They hire the people to basically those that support their political parties. So if you're talking in terms of certain state-owned enterprises that are purely commercial, there are countless. There are, I think, even the numbers vary sometimes. You hear the number around there are 525, then again sometimes there are around 300, and then you have your 52 of course strategic SOEs. So I think there's a huge portion there that really is maybe occupying underutilized land, probably empty buildings, overstaffed, that can really be just wiped off the slate and divested. Then you get to a little bit more of the complicated areas. One is, yes, the place where you have complete state monopoly, like the petroleum industry, but there you open up the market and you basically let competitors in. For example, CPC itself is not really being fully privatized, if you think about it. I think you have spoken about this as well, and there's been discussion around it. It's really letting the players in. And then also, another approach is you go for your private-public partnerships. So yes, you have the government in it, and you also bring in basically your either foreign investors or even local investors. And there you kind of get to an extent the best of both worlds in instances you come completely. For example, if you take Sri Lanka Airlines, that period that Emirates was in, I think they've actually paying back dividends to the treasury. But when the state took over completely, I think you can see completely how the profits went off and just loss. So that for certain SOEs that the government doesn't want to completely get out of, that's another model that you can look at your private-public partnerships. And then finally, you might have certain SOEs that the state wants to keep kind of complete control on. But the problem is here, there is no kind of accountability, there is no proper governance. For example, some of these, the annual reports are not done. You might have the audited reports, but there's no final annual report published. Yeah. So there you need to kind of, ensure that these governance practices are put in. You bring in your corporate governance practices, you put in hard budget constraints, and basically you make sure that these would run with proper transparency and accountability. And of course, you also have the option, for example, like the TEMSEC model, where these would all essentially be consolidated, and then the consolidated company would be listed in the on the public stock exchange. So then essentially all of these would need to comply to the standards that any company listed on the stock exchange would be. You would have once again a much higher level of accountability, more transparency on what's happening, and you won't suddenly look at your books and see, oh, we racked up so much of debt. It's not going to be in the billions. It's not going to be, huge losses year after year. These problems will immediately be identified and rectified before they kind of compound and bring us where we are today. Yeah. So I think the SOEs, you need to take a slightly nuanced approach. It's understandable that you can't completely, wipe everything is privatized, but at the same time, you have to, we need, what we've done hasn't worked. We have to move forward and make those reforms. Again, basically changed according to each sector's or each specific situation's needs. So I think that would kind of be the main points over there.
Right. So what you're saying is, instead of having a blanket approach towards reformation of SOEs, instead of saying completely sell all of them and hand it over to the private sector, that in a case-by-case basis, that perhaps the ones that are really not making any money, that we can divest it and sell it off or hand it over to the private sector, or in certain cases we can go in private-public partnerships, and it basically depends on a case-by-case situation, right?
Just to clarify, so when you say case by case, obviously you won't be going one by one and repeating the process. You want to come up with kind of like a categorization to kind of figure out how. Then just one more thing I want to add while we're on this topic. I think it's important that transparency is maintained and due procedure, or you do your due diligence with the bidders, you keep the bidding process competitive, and you keep the public informed. So I think also one of the places where a lot of this opposition will come in is if the process is not transparent. If people feel like, okay, what's really happening? Are they being sold off to unknown entities, something like that? But if you keep the process, I think, transparent, and you follow, international best practices, you keep everything competitive and open, a lot of these problems and fears can be mitigated. And at the same time, you make sure that the privatized process works well, and you don't end up with maybe, let's say, the same people who are in charge of it currently or running it under the state. So you make sure you don't want them to again end up with private use. You want to make sure that that process is done or carried out properly.
Right. Okay. Now, speaking to what you just said, Avishka, about how what we're doing so far isn't working, and now it's time that we make a complete change or some sort of change in the way that things are done. I believe post-COVID and post-economic crisis, if I can say so, and the lack of liquidity crunch that we had with our foreign exchange, there has been a lot of restrictions on our imports and a lot of taxation on to de-incentivize people from bringing products down, and that has really affected the market and the choices that the consumer can make. Do you think going forward that is something that we need to relook at as with our governance?
So I am guessing you're talking basically about your trade reform, your agenda for trade. Yeah, so I think on that line, that's definitely something that needs to be done. I think since around 2000, continuously we have been shifting away from being more of an open economy to more kind of a closed economy. So this whole issue with you're preventing your imports, all of that. One, yes, it's a bit tricky in terms of the situation we are in. So it's very easy to say, okay, let's just ban all these imports so we can save foreign revenue. But there are a lot of consequences here. And I think once our kind of our balance of payments has somewhat stabilized now that the funds are also coming in, we need to start phasing it out. We need to start, because you can remove your restrictions, let's say your import ban, which basically that prohibits any import, right? You can remove that and you can put a really high tariff. Because
Right.
what that will do, it will allow some kind of access to the market. And in fact, there'll be some kind of imports. And then through that, there will be at least even some kind of government revenue.
Okay.
Because also if you think about our import structure, a lot of products or majority are in your capital goods and your intermediary goods. Not so much your consumer goods might be better off, but I think it's around 20% to 19%.
Okay.
So your actual consumer goods is not that high. And the problem is if you ban these intermediary goods or these capital goods, these are the goods that are going to be used essentially to produce other things. So in the short term, by putting a ban, while you might be better off and save maybe a couple of dollars, there can be, when you have bans for extended time, there can be a lot of consequences, to the economy. And the damage might be seen, in the long term, we'll be doing a lot more damage to our economy and our production capacity. So one thing we want to think about there is phasing out the, quantitative restrictions,
Right.
adopting tariffs, and then of course in the long run, there's a lot of tariff reform we have to do as well. So as you may know, you have your para tariffs, for example, your cess, your PAL, which are added on top of your custom duties. And on top of that, when you take basically all your various tariff rates, there's a lot of variance. You have 0, you have 5, you have 20, you have 30, you have some even more. So it's kind of all over the place, right? So one is obviously it allows for corruption, because you want to kind of get your product into a tariff that is low, and at the same time it makes the whole process of importing exporting a lot more complicated. So one thing you want to look at, this is maybe a little bit more down the line, once you said you phased out your quantitative restrictions or import bans, you want to kind of rationalize a tariff structure. So you remove your maybe your para first, and then you kind of combine all your tariffs to 3 bands. So the rates can vary, maybe 5, 10, 15, or maybe 0, 10, 20, whatever that is. But basically, we simplify the whole tariff structure. And then, of course, beyond that, you can work on, these are long-term plans, like long-term reforms. You would essentially work on phasing it down, to lower rates. For example, how India started this whole reform in the 1991, how Chile went about it.
Yeah.
You need to phase it out, have a proper plan, and then you bring it and be closer to essentially a unified tariff rate. Maybe you don't even go to that level, maybe you have a free tariff plan. But the point is, you need to start. We are right at the back end now. We have like complete bans on imports. So we need to start taking steps so we can get to that point where we think, okay, what exactly is the best policy in how we structure our tariffs? So I think in terms of the whole talk on import tariff or taxes on imports, that would be the kind of reforms you address. But I think there's a lot more in terms of trade, your facilitation, your trade agreements, to foster investment, all of that I think.
Right. And something that I thought of while you were talking about is how we need to improve the governance of our economy, right? And I think a couple of weeks ago or sometime last month, an anti-corruption bill was introduced, and that is a step in the right direction. But perhaps we need to strengthen it, and this implementation needs to happen in a timely manner. And we need to have an aura or like some sort of, how would you say it, some sort of onus to hold our politicians accountable and to stop bureaucratic levels of corruption from occurring, to make sure that governance in itself is efficient and equitable. And also I think we should also look at things such as institutional reforms, perhaps strengthening the Auditor General's powers, safeguarding his financial and administrative independence. I think even if you look at the new CB Central Bank Act that is put out, we are also looking at more independence towards the central bank and monetary policy board that is to be set up according to that. If we can go through the steps that Supreme Court has passed out in special determination. Things like that can be done over time to make sure that governance in terms of our economy improves, and to make sure that execution of social and economical policies to help growth in society are encouraged by the state.
Yeah, so I think there's a bit to unpack there. I wouldn't say all of these can be done overnight per se, and I think one thing I would essentially flag is it's even with this kind of anti-corruption laws, it's very easy to have like a good legislation on paper. It's a brilliant law on paper, but that is the starting point. You want to have good laws on paper, but equally important is basically how are you going to go about implementing it? Because if you have that law and you basically don't follow it, or it's badly implemented, or there's a loophole, found out. Basically, if the enforcement isn't there, it's not going to be very effective. And I think this is a problem that has plagued us like for so many years. So many laws, so many
Right.
initiatives have started, but it's never followed up, or the implementation just falls flat on its face. So I think that is one thing the government or the institutions will need to develop, make sure that these are actually implemented, developing a comprehensive kind of agenda to tackle anti-competitive. And I think the IMF also is going to be doing like an analysis of basically and the corruption in Sri Lanka. So I think that should be out maybe towards the end of this year. So that will also give some kind of direction in terms of where the problem lies, what are the critical points to address. Institutional reforms, yes, I think you already covered on powers, the central bank. These are all steps, but I think there also needs to be kind of monitoring in place to make sure, okay, are these things working? Are they being carried out the way they should be?
Right.
And if not, what changes do we need to make? And also things like, for example, code. How do we improve this better? It's something that has been working better in recent times. But okay, we have something that works. How do we improve this? How do we make sure there's kind of more accountability and more transparency in that? Because again, one thing we go back to is our government essentially defaulted because we don't have enough money to pay. So that means you manage your finances badly. So there needs to be mechanisms that are constantly, keeping the government's finances in check. And I think also this is where the need for having mid-term expenditure frameworks come in. So you're not only looking, budget to budget, or you're not looking at election cycle to cycle. You're looking at things a little bit more long term, and when you realize maybe 1 year you're off the target, you take measures to kind of correct it and make sure you stay on target the next year. And things like setting up the budget office, making sure these function properly so you don't get like unrealistic budgets. So whatever comes out, you see whether other government actually hitting their targets, are they actually collecting the revenue they're supposed to?
Right.
Are they keeping the spending level below what is budget, or are they going above? Those kind of things need to be done. And at the same time, I think that needs to be shared with now the citizenry, right? People need to know, okay, what exactly is going on? Where are our tax money going? Because I think that's also one of the reasons you have so much of dissent and, protest against some of these reforms that are going on. Because people not want to get informed, and there's overall sense of like transparency and accountability. So I think when you make sure that this information is one publicly available, and you keep the public informed in what's happening, and you have these kind of checks, and you show that accountability is something real. It's not just something that's there for the sake of it on paper, but no one is actually held accountable. That's when you actually get citizens buy-in, and I think the trusting government and the state and everything has really fallen to an all-time low. And if we are to kind of get it back up there, we need to have these good governance mechanisms in place. And it needs to be not just laws that are passed, but actual concrete actions and implementation that the people can have confidence in that. But yeah, I think that is another vital area that reforms need to be done, and it needs to be monitored to make sure
Right.
things don't go off track again.
So what you're saying is, at least what I can gather, is that it's not just enough for us to push for these superfluous acts and institutions to be set up, but it's also vital that we make sure regulation and monitoring of these institutions and monitoring of the implementation of these acts also happen in a timely manner. Because, as you said very fairly, government citizen trust in the government is at an all-time low, and that's why people are so unwilling to even pay their taxes and whatnot. So, was I right in assuming that, Avishka?
Yeah, kind of along those lines. It is important also that you know get the law. You get it off the ground with your
Oh,
lawyers
for
and
sure.
your framework. But it's a continuous process basically. Like you can't just do this again. We come back to the theme like we're looking for this one-off solution. Oh, we sell the monkeys and they're kind of sorted.
Yeah.
No, you need to, the anti-corruption law is not going to be your 100,000 monkeys that's going to earn you so much, or like your Disneyland investment or whatever. It's a start, and then you make sure that this is continuously done and implemented.
Right. So Avishka, is there anything else that you would like to discuss when it comes that you think is pertinent to the economic reformation, or do you feel like that we've hit the nail on the head with everything so far?
So, I mean, I suppose we might have missed a couple of times, but I think there's a couple of other things I just want to I think is worth flagging. Your whole link between, trade and investment, your FDI, and the need essentially to create a business-friendly environment. Because we talk so many times, okay, why don't people come and invest in Sri Lanka? We have certain things that work. For example, your export processing zones or your free trade zones.
Yeah.
That model was shown to work. So one, we need to improve it. We need to make sure the BOI is truly a one-stop shop. That whoever comes there, they can get a fast process through, it's done. And remove the restrictions. I think there's a $200,000 restriction, there are minimum thresholds that you need to invest in. So we can bring those down.
Yeah.
And we can look at even more innovative solutions in terms of FDI. So currently, the BOI, the state runs these industrial zones. But what about if you lease out the lands and you have like a private company or a public-private partnership kind of set up the infrastructure, the water, everything? It's basically essentially plug and play. They set it up and then you market that out and then you have the investors coming in. But I mean, for example, take Port City. The reason, there are no investments coming in, one major reason is, this whole business environment. Things are not clear. There is no certainty for anyone who comes in. So one day you can have one law and one policy, and then suddenly the next day it's completely, reversed. And obviously that's not how businesses operate. You need to have some certain certainty, and there needs to be, a business-friendly environment. I think there used to be the index, the ease of doing business index, which is I think discontinued in around 2020, if I'm not mistaken. But Sri Lanka obviously ranked pretty low there. So there are like easy stuff that can be done. For example, making the application process for setting up a company, a business much easier. That will encourage more people, even your local domestics, to get involved in these business activities. Land is another huge area. You have the state owning or having sole ownership of around 83%, but then the state also doesn't know where the lands are. The state doesn't know what lands you own. The investor who comes in is asking, okay, I need to lease so much of land. Where can I find it? More often than not, these officials are clueless, and you need to go, you need to find it. It's a very complicated procedure, and that's not how other countries do it, right? Other countries would say, look, we have this land available, this is for this is for that, take your pick, kind of. But here you have all these small stuff. But I mean, we've gone to, let's say, a Gram Nidaya, any government institute, to just get a letter signed. It's such a, you're tired of it. You're like, oh my God, you're sick, your entire day is kind of ruined, right? Imagine having to do this multiple times in multiple different institutions just to set up a business, and you want to invest in this country. So things like that need to be fixed. You need to, make it easy for anyone who wants to come in and set up, both locally and foreign. And I think the last thing is, we have a lot of regulations sometimes that don't make sense. More often than not, they say, they have some huge goal, but if you look at it, there's probably some kind of political motivation behind it. That this businessman that didn't bribe a politician or something like that, and they want to cut them out. So we need to also look at all the legislations we have or the regulatory restrictions we have, and see what actually is, for example, national security, health, safety. Yeah, totally. We need to do a proper analysis, see what actually. What are the legislations that actually achieve this aim, and what are those that are just pretending and are just shouldn't be there, and kind of do away with those and kind of reform that whole sector. I think the final point is, one more thing I'd like to flag is you have these things developed. For example, like the national export strategy. You have your trade facilitation, the agreement proceeded to the national single window. We had a lot of these initiatives that again, you kind of took off but didn't really took off. They're not properly carried through. They're not properly implemented. They are, kind of stop starts. We need to go back. We need to make sure we implement all these things. And once they're started, we follow through. So it's not kind of a stop start every day the policy changes kind of. There's a proper framework in place, and we commit to it, and we do these reforms, and we anchor these reforms, ideally through legislature. So it's not kind of a gazette or a policy thing where the president or the minister next day can change it over. You anchor these reforms. So I think that's where the law comes in important.
Right.
So businesses know you have this law they can rely on, and you create that certainty and this environment that is like, okay, if I come in, I know my business is good for another 5-10 years, right? Things are not going to suddenly change. And that's kind of how you make sure the environment is conducive to these businesses that essentially will help, will employ people, will bring the tech in, and essentially will help the country, and economic growth.
Right. So I think we discussed quite a lot of reforms that we feel through Advocata that are important, at least in the intermediary, to make sure that we recover from this crisis. But I just like to reiterate, what we started off the sentiment of this AdvoChats with, is that perhaps it's time that we stop looking for one-stop solutions. Perhaps a Disneyland coming in, or even at some point, we heard of Sri Lanka being this education hub where you would have Ivy League universities coming and setting up their appendages here, whether it's be selling monkeys or, some politicians like to prawn about perhaps the legalization of cannabis and like the export and sale of that. While these flowery things are really great to hear in an election cycle, and this is exactly what people want to hear, sometimes the bitter truth is that the reforms that are needed are not the easiest pills to swallow. And like Avishka, spent the better part of half an hour describing to us and explaining to us what these reforms are and how they need to take place and why they are important, I think that's something that we should pay attention to. And I hope that those of you that have joined us today are able to keep following us on our platforms as we keep continuing to push reforms and these reforms that are necessary throughout our social media and as time to come, until we see, like Avishka said, not just superfluous, over-the-top brush acts or gadgets that are passed just to quench the public, but real, meaningful, impactful, long-lasting change that can occur at an important junction like this. So Avishka, I'd like to thank you for coming today and giving us your valuable time and helping us understand what is important at this juncture. Is there anything you'd like to add before signing off?
No, I think just one thing you said about reforms being bitter pills. I guess one problem is if you don't do the correct reforms like the proper way. For example, if you start off with safety nets, it can become extremely bitter. So you need to make sure you're doing all the reforms like it's a comprehensive package. So the pain is mitigated. But it's important to know these benefits are going to be reached in the long run.
Yes.
It's short-term pain for long-term gain. So the problem is all this time we having short-term gain for long-term pain. So we need to kind of reverse that. And I think that's saying something important everyone needs to keep in mind, and hopefully even the policymakers as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, Avishka. See you, and to everyone who joined us, thank you so much. And we'll catch you next week on our next session of AdvoChats. All right. See you.
See you.